Welcome everyone to our first Kavli Conversation on Science Communication of the fall 2023 semester. My name is Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of science journalism here at NYU, the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. And yes, as you can tell from all those titles, we really do care about science communication here at NYU. And I am absolutely thrilled to begin with an amazing panel that we're calling, well, let's see, what did we call it? Climate, Smoke, and Climate Justice. Nope, that's repetitive. Anyway, we have two absolutely wonderful speakers in Joseph Wilkins and Jeff Goodell. Joseph is an authority on the health effects of wildlife smoke. Jeff just wrote a fantastic book called The Heat Will Kill You First. That is all the rage in the environmental community. So we're very fortunate to have them. Robin Lloyd, our moderator and organizer today, will give you more information on them, but I will just say briefly about Robin that she is a visiting scholar here at NYU Journalism, and is a veteran science editor and writer and is really good at what she does. So Robin, take it away.
Thanks, Dan. Well, it's my pleasure to moderate tonight's event, our Kavli Conversation here at NYU, and to see so many interested in-person attendees, and welcome to our online audience as well. The germ for the topic of tonight's discussion, heat, smoke, and climate justice, grew out of a massive spike that some of us in the East Coast experienced in air pollution that took place this summer in the Northeast and throughout much of the East Coast. Wildfires, as we all recall, throughout Canada, some are still burning, severely affected this regions and further south as well and north, and many our air quality, and many East Coasters were surprised and ill-prepared to respond to the local impacts. The increase, however, in our conversations perhaps in this region is a little late from the perspective of the rest of the country or the rest of the world. Such urgent conversations have been taking place, of course, in the US West and beyond, and questions have been concerning, of course, climate change mitigation and adaptation, land management practices around fire management, forest management, and all these factors have led to an alarming trend, of course, in increasingly frequent wildfires. I just wanted to throw out a few statistics. This is just a subset of what's going on today from one in the US, from one website that I looked at. I read that there is one fire burning in Florida, one in Michigan, one in Florida, 2 in New Jersey, 26 in Montana, 25 in California, and 291 in Texas. I don't know if that site's accurate, but I would not, well, I don't know if it is. Meanwhile, heat waves are causing severe damage as well this past year in the western US, southern Europe, and parts of Asia. In the US, July was the worst temperature-wise, heat-wise for many regions. Texas, Nevada, California, Mexico suffered tremendously. Phoenix's temperature reached 119 degrees for a few days, and it broke a record, that city, for the most consecutive days with highs over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and that streak was 31 days. Ocean temperatures off of the coast of Florida measured higher than ever. They broke records threatening marine life systems and our lives. On the upside, and there are many, depending on your perspective, a large number of media outlets are on the climate beat, doing great work, on the wildfires beat, on the air pollution beat, and we're eager to tell even better stories about these issues and the disparate impact of them on people and life on Earth. Tonight's guests have studied these issues deeply and thought deeply about them, both the mundane and the technical aspects of heat and smoke. Dr. Joseph P. Wilkins works as an assistant professor at Howard University. His research focuses on remote sensing tools and air quality model development. He earned a BS in atmospheric science and minored in physics at the University of Louisville, and later completed his MS and PhD in meteorology with a concentration in air quality and pollution at St. Louis University. Dr. Wilkins is a leading researcher in the fire modeling community. He has published his research widely, and he communicates about it across government and academic institutions globally. The overall impact of his research program is to increase BIPOC participation in atmospheric research by creating workforce-ready programmers and scientists. Jeff Goodell's latest book is a New York Times bestseller. It's called The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. He's the author of 6 previous books, including The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World. This was a New York Times Critics' Top Book of 2017. He has covered climate change for more than 2 decades at Rolling Stone and discussed climate and energy issues on several outlets: NPR, MSNBC, CNN, NBC, and The Oprah Winfrey Show. That's really actually great reach. He is a 2020 Guggenheim Fellow. So for both of you, I think some of us are just waking up, some of us woke up a long time ago, but how aware, either can go first, how aware do you think that people in the US are of the threat of heat waves, increasingly hot weather, and wildfire air pollution? Why do these events still, well, I'll separate that question. How aware do we think people are?
Well, I think people are waking up to it. However, no one is really aware to the massive issues that are coming their way. And so this is an issue that I think will continue to grow. And as it grows more and more, it'll hit the oh crap point, to where we've hit the point to where we can no longer go back to the way things were. And that's when people will start to pay attention, such as now, which the increasing wildfires, the increasing temperatures, we're starting to get to the precipice of that point, but we haven't got there yet. It's still gonna get worse. And it will continue to get worse until people wake up. So no, I don't think people are aware.
Hopefully this summer had, some impact on how people think about the risks of not just heat and wildfires, but climate change in general. But, I'm not, I've been writing about this for a long time, and I don't think there's any kind of, going to be some kind of mass awakening moment where everyone's going to come together, and instead of having 50,000 people marching in the streets like we did a couple of weeks ago here, we have 550,000 people and a kind of climate revolution, energy revolution happening. I think it's a long, slow fight. I think that it's trench warfare, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think this summer imprinted on us a lot about the dangers of heat and smoke and all of that, but I think that will go away and we will forget about it. And just like with, hurricanes, when I started covering climate change 20 years ago, I was out in the North Atlantic with a climate scientist from Woods Hole, and I said to him, what do you think it will take to wake America up to the risks of climate change? And this was 20 years ago, and he said, well, I think when a big hurricane comes and wipes out a major American city, people will wake up and they'll realize the consequences. And of course, we've had 5 hurricanes, there's 6 hurricanes now that have wiped out American cities: Sandy, Katrina, Harvey, you name it. And yes, there's been progress, but I'm not a big believer in the Grand Awakening idea.
Okay. One thing I wanted to ask you right away, may I call you Mr. Goodell or Jeff?
How about Jeff? Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I always
Jeff
feel like
and
I'm in
Joseph?
trouble when someone calls me Mr. Goodell. It's like, am I in court?
Anyway, when I mentioned to family, friends, associates that I was reading your book, and I would say the title, "The Heat Will Kill You First," and right there, they went silent generally, or had 0 questions. Perhaps a couple of them I noticed would let out a nervous laugh, but then there was no follow-up, no reaction. It's a great read. It's a page-turning science nonfiction book, and it's a page-turner. Why do you think people have that reaction to your book title? Or maybe I just hang out in the wrong crowd.
Well, no, I had that reaction to the book title when I thought of it. It's a provocative title, and there was a lot of debate between myself and my friends and my publisher about the title. Some advocated something more like Heat, and I was like, well, there's been 12 movies with that name, and I don't know, that just seems very generic. And one of the things that made me really want to push this title, and myself and my editor and my agent were really kind of uniform behind this title, to the skepticism of others at my publishing house and many friends of mine who said, you're committing career suicide by naming a book this, and no one's going to read it, and it's too scary, and nobody wants to be scared. But my point, and the point of this book, is to really take all of this talk and reporting and thinking about climate change and all this data and all this information and really make it about you and your life now. And I think too much writing and thinking and talking and everything about the climate crisis is somehow remote. And this title made it about you, obviously. I mean, we even debated whether we should change it to the heat will kill us first. But then it was like, no, I want to implicate you in this. I want you to pick up this book and feel like your life is at risk, and that I wanted to bring it into the here and now. And you can judge for yourself whether you think it's a good title or not. I feel like it kind of works, because I feel like that's the point of the book. It tells you immediately what the point of the book is. And there's a lot of concern right now, which I share, about doomerism, and that we're too scary and this and that. And I am certainly not a doomer in any sense. And the book, I think, has a kind of optimistic take on this in a very strange way, as you may or not agree. But I sometimes think that we're not alarmed enough, not doomed, but not alarmed enough. I don't think many people, including myself, really grasp the scope and scale of what we're talking about when we talk about something like the climate crisis.
So can I jump in? So I think the title was close. I think the title should have been "The Heat is Already Killing You," because there's massive amounts of deaths that we see per year, in the thousands, of heat already. And you can look into the recent heat wave that happened in Seattle not too long ago, where many homes don't have air conditioning. Most people don't live in conditions where they feel like they need them in their homes, so they're not designed this way. And if you have 100-degree temperature days, many days in a row, your elderly, your children, yourself, in some cases, if you're like asthmatic, such as myself, you can't live in those conditions, you will pass. And I've had colleagues that had to literally stay in hotels in their own cities in order to survive. And you've seen cases in Paris and other places in Europe where, again, these places aren't built to handle heat increasing by 5 degrees or 10 degrees or whatever the case may be. And remember, climate change is not uniform in many cities. So some will increase by 20 degrees in the next couple decades. Some will increase negative, right? And so we have to be very cognizant of this heat issue, because it's going to cause you to not be able to go to work, to school. It's going to not be able to cause infrastructure. You've seen all the construction in New York. We're sitting in this city. If they can't go outside and do their job, it's going to cause you to have delays in commute, delays in this, or more energy is going to be needed to be produced, which is going to cause more pollution. So you have these power generation sectors that's going to have to do double, triple the work just to help that 1 degree increase that we're projecting, which is actually a low projection. And so that's why I think this is a good title, but I think it should be more pervasive, actually. So, yeah.
What kind of reactions do you get when you talk to lay people or people outside your field that you study exposure to wildfire and how wildfire smoke travels?
So mostly people look at me and go, "Oh, that's cool, thank you." And they, because I am the more doom and gloom type, right? Because I'm a realist, I like to say, is that, for example, when the fire smoke just passed in June, right? I told many of my friends, I was yelling at everyone who would listen, do not go outside. This is a death event. You should look at it the same as, would you go outside if a tornado was coming your way? And people look at me like, it's not the same. It actually is. It's actually worse. Something that can cause cancer, bronchitis, other things that can kill you, it's just the same as if a tornado hit you, which you're actually least likely to have that happen versus pollution event. We're talking about 60,000 deaths per year in the United States for outdoor pollution. Do you want to be a part of that 60,000? So I tell folks all the time, if they don't listen to me, just go outside and take a deep breath, job security, right? But also, I don't want you to die, I want you to be alive. So for me, it's like my general reaction, people just say, oh, there goes Joe again, or there goes Joseph with his little conspiracy theories on how air quality is going to kill us all. Like, no, the data's showing this. It's already taken out. It costs the globe, I think it's $7 to $9 million a year, air quality related. And this doesn't include getting hit by a car walking up the street. Like, this is just purely just breathing. And so it's pretty serious already, and it's going to get worse. So, yeah, ignore me if you want.
Not going to ignore you. Well, I wanted to get right into the justice aspect of our title tonight, and I think many people these days are aware of the huge income divide that we have in the United States and the biases in systems that have led to wealth accumulation among white people and more affluent people, and the wealth deprivation among people of color in the U.S. and the less affluent. But Jeff, your book introduced me to at least a new area that this plays out in climate impacts, and a recurring theme that I really appreciated in The Heat Will Kill You First is the thermal divide. That was the exact phrase that you used most of the time. You wrote that this is, quote, an invisible but very real line that separates the cool from the suffering, the lucky from the damned. Powerful writing. And then you talked about a professor of urban studies at Portland State University in Oregon, Vivek Chandas. He measured during the 2021 Northwest U.S. Heat wave that Joseph just mentioned, that he drove around with his son or his child and measured air temperature degree of, on one day during that heat wave, of 124 degrees in Portland, Oregon, in the poorest neighborhoods, and 99 degrees the same day in a tree-lined suburb of Portland. So the question I have there from both of you is, to what extent should science journalists and communicators keep top of mind and keep top of focus when we're writing about climate change, fire, and smoke exposure and heat, the disparate and unequal effects of these factors, of these conditions?
Well, I think that these questions of social justice and climate justice are the story. I mean, that is what the climate crisis is about. Broadly speaking, it's about what the rich people of the North did, pumping up, burning fossil fuels, loading the air with CO2, and, causing basically this problem, which right now the global South, people who can least afford it and did nothing to cause it, are suffering for and dying as a result of. And that's the macro scale. And then you can focus that all the way down to the micro scale, like you talked about. In every city, if you look at it, I never thought about it quite this way until I started writing this book and thinking about heat. But you go to virtually any city in America, and you go to the wealthy neighborhoods, and they have like big, beautiful oak trees and lots of green space and lawns and things like that. And then you go to the poorer neighborhoods, whether it's in Austin where I live, or in LA, or in Portland, or Dallas, or Louisville, or anywhere you want to name. The streets it's concrete, it's little trees that are dying because nobody's taking care of them. Many of the people who live there don't have air conditioning. I mean, I think this question of justice is the story of the climate crisis, and I think as someone who writes about it, that has to be forefront in everything you do. I think this is not only true in the human realm, I think it's also true in the animal world. I mean, it's like we are taking away, because of our indulgences and our burning of fossil fuels and our refusal to really do anything about that, we are, causing many species to go extinct, where it's having a profound impact on the natural world in ways that, these butterflies did not cause this problem. Polar bear that almost ate me, and you can read all about that in the last chapter of my book, a little plug. She was hungry, and she had 2 cubs. And it wasn't because she didn't know how to hunt or because she didn't know where the shopping mall was. She was hungry because the ice is disappearing in Baffin Island, where I was, and can no longer hunt for seals as long into the year. So I think that this questions of justice is, like I said, central. But it's last thing I'll add is that it's sort of new. 10 years ago, when people were writing about climate change, it was more just like generic, we're all in trouble, climate is changing, what are we going to do kind of thing. There was this sense that we're all in this together. And I think that now it's very clear that we're not all in this together, really. I mean, in some mega sense we are, but more clearly, as a journalist, as someone who's writing about this, I think that, you know, focusing on these justice issues and this inequality of who caused this and who's suffering is the lens to see this story through.
Yeah, I'd like to say, as a journalist, you are spot on with where the science is going. So we've recently had huge amounts of programs that cropped up. So if you look it up, Justice 40 is a huge initiative started by the White House where they're pushing 40% of each dollar to be related to fixing type of justice issues related to different groups of underserved communities. And we've seen a huge dichotomy switch where even the way we educate students and the way we look at research, we're mixing in different groups from different socioeconomic backgrounds to consider all help, right? So it's like if you just only consider Caucasians, for example, it's only about 40% of the population. So you're cutting off the rest of the help, right? Essentially of who can fix the climate issues. And so now that we're bringing everybody to the forefront, it's like, what is your community experiencing? Because if you've seen, for example, in different cities, you can have 10 years lifespan changes based off where you grew up. And that's a huge issue. And if it's just because of things like redlining or things like where your family was able to afford or giving home loans to go or where the renters are or where the cross to the tracks are, how close are you to the highways, all these things we're starting to acknowledge are the huge issues that have been the underlying thing. So a lot of times when, as Jeff mentioned, you were talking about climate change, it was a broad brush. CO2 is bad, emissions are coming from here, blah, 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 woe is me, and it's not. It's really some people. So, for example, in research, we've seen that African Americans, Latinx community are seeing 50% to even 75% and sometimes more pollution than our white counterparts. And this is the justice issue. It's not always the person's fault that's living in the better neighborhood, but it's the reason why they're in that neighborhood. You know, and we can all argue, but I'm not a social scientist, so I'm not going to touch that part. But we know that it exists, right? And we can see it scientifically, and we can make these pretty maps of each and every city, each and every community, down to the neighborhood you're in, and we can see there's a huge difference. And this is the issue that we're now waking up to as scientists to say, okay, I can't just say DC is worse pollution than blah, blah, blah city. It's not that simple, right? And so this is where it's going. And I'm glad journalists are getting on board. And hopefully our journalist counterparts will get everyone else on board to listen to what the science is showing. And the data's there. Statistics are there. So, yeah.
Jeff, I have to be a little confrontational and ask, and it's sort of a journalism question and also a writing question, but I noticed that the first anecdote, and believe me, it made me cry. It was great.
The first anecdote made you cry?
Excuse me, chapter 1, or no, it's chapter 2 is about this affluent couple in, I don't know, Silicon Valley basically, goes out on a hike, bad things happen. I don't want to give it away because it's an amazing story. You talk about putting the focus on the have-nots or the more affected, impoverished community, but you chose to start the book, I think, anecdotally with, you know, this personal connection with a fairly affluent couple. Quite really. What was behind that decision?
Well, a number of things. First of all, it was a great story in a tragic, terrible way, but it really was a story it was about a family who moved out of Silicon Valley during the pandemic and bought a house in this Sierra Nevada foothills in a town called Mariposa. And Richard Garish was 43, I think. Ellen Chung was in her late 30s. They had a 1.5-year-old child and a dog. And they went for a hike one day on a hot day, and they didn't come back that night. And the next morning, their family and friends were wondering what happened. Sheriff's Department sent out a search party. They kind of knew where they had gone, and they found the entire family dead on the trail. And at first, people thought, oh, this was, you know, some terrible family suicide or something, or some kind of crime. And then when there was no evidence of that, then it was like, oh, they stumbled across an abandoned mine, and carbon monoxide from the mine came out, and they all died when they breathed the carbon monoxide in. Or they had stopped at the river, and there was some kind of bacteria in the river that they all drank that killed them simultaneously. And it took about a month of investigation to figure out that no, what happened is they were hiking on a hot day up a steep slope, and they had heat stroke and died, all of them, including the dog. And you can read more details about it in the book. But I chose it because, first of all, it was a very dramatic story that captured one's attention, which is important in a book about climate change, trying to figure out ways to engage readers. I also felt it was, you know, an every person's story. It felt like the kind of thing that a lot of readers could relate to, even that whether they're affluent or not affluent. I didn't really care. I mean, I write a lot about, you know, the thermal divide and racial and class divisions in the book. And I don't feel like, you know, as a writer, I need to be a kind of slave to that in every context, right? I mean, I can write just a compelling story. And I wanted it to feel like everybody is at risk, and not just, you know, I call heat a kind of predatory force in the book, and I talk about how people who live in lower income neighborhoods, but also people who are elderly and have health conditions and stuff are more vulnerable. But I really wanted it to tell an everyman story, and I felt like that story was as close as I could get to something like that. And, you know, as a writer, especially a writer like me who likes to tell stories, and this was a difficult story to tell for a lot of personal reasons, just in the sense of, you know, when you're writing about a family tragedy like this, there's a lot of moral burden on you as a writer to get it right and to have purpose for the story. And luckily, I got the blessing of some of the family members who really wanted this family's death to mean something, for some lessons to be drawn from it. And I think without the blessing of the family who's trusted me and allowed me to write about this and, you know, kind of told me the story, I couldn't have done it.
Joseph, is there a smoke exposure divide too? I'm pretty sure there is. You talk about it in your, you nod to it in your research.
So, yes and no. In some degrees, is that it's mostly people think that you're close to the smoke, you're at risk, but typically you're often less at risk when you're closer to it. It's usually the smoke that gets up and moves around and ages and gets more chemical you know, I won't go through the details.
Oh, we like details.
Oh, well, fine. So smoke goes up, you burn stuff, sun hits it, photolyzes, and it becomes worse pollution, such as ozone is formed this way. Most of us know ozone. It's an O3 chemical that gets in your system and eats away at your ability to breathe and do functions, and it causes cancer and all these other harmful things. And so fire does this with 10,000 more pollutants inside of it, whether you know it or not. And so that stuff, as it ages, goes further downwind, and it gets into our system. It's more toxic than it is up close. So fresh fire tends to be less toxic than non-fresh fire. Fire smoke, that is. And so if you have it to where you're going into different areas, and this is where the justice side comes in, if I'm a person who's affluent, I can just go away. Or I can just shut my doors, windows, turn on my super nice HEPA filter, EPA quality, blah, 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 and I can just put my air quality filter on in the house too, because I got a double back system. In my baby's room, I have this, I can turn it on, everybody's fine. Now, if I'm not in this scenario and I don't even have an AC system that I can rely on, what am I doing most of the time when it gets hot as the heat comes up? Opening my window up. Do you think I care about what air quality is out there when I'm burning up in the house with my fan on? I'm going to open that window up, catch the breeze, air comes in. Now I'm breathing the in-house pollution as well as the out-house pollution. And so this is what the big issue is that that's the divide, is that your resilience is what we call it, your ability to fight back. You have fewer opportunities to fight back if you don't have the socioeconomic status, so if you don't have the know-it-all. So if you're not aware of it, you can't fight it. That's what I tell people. This is why we're trying to advocate. This is why we're doing these panels, is so people can know you can fight back. You don't have to just accept bad pollution. You don't have to just accept bad air quality. You can do things such as wear a mask. We learned during COVID, right? Wear your mask. If you wear it, it'll help prevent. Same thing with fires. If you prevent particles from getting in your system acts better. Who would know, right? And so this is what we tell people, that we're trying to alert people to this, but as you know, during COVID, it's expensive to constantly buy a mask, to constantly buy filters, to constantly do this. It's not easy for everyone. We take it for granted for those of us who can just run to the Walmart or the local store and just buy something, right? I can go to the store right now and buy a filter and just turn it on in my house. Everybody can't do that. And some people, it's a choice between whether I'm going to eat tonight or buy this filter. You know they're going to pick to eat, right? And so when we're dealing with these communities, we have to be cognizant of that. And that's where the smoke divide tends to happen. Because usually the rich people want to live in the mountains with the nice smoke. And then you can see cases like 2016, where for those who know Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge, where there's a really nice vacation area for most rich people or people who got some money, caught on fire. Literally, a lot of it burned down. And so that caused a lot of smoke issues, but the smoke wasn't impacted there, it was downwind. And so this is usually what we see. So.
Can you tell everyone, Gatlinburg,
Oh, Tennessee, sorry. Yeah, I've been there a couple times, it's nice.
middle of the country, more or less?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Dan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I thought I would just get the questions going
Oh, yeah, let's do
in
it.
an effort to encourage everyone else too. Just line on up behind me when you're ready. You know, there's another divide that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that's the divide between the climate savvy and everyone else. I guess it has been referred to obliquely, but it seems to me that an ever-increasing percentage of climate communication is directed at folks who are already activated on climate in one way or another. And part of that surely is because the climate issue has become politicized, as we know, and so there's a certain percentage of the population that may be unreachable. But it seems like there are still a lot of folks who, you know, understand that climate change is something that they're supposed to be concerned about, but they don't really fully understand why. And so I guess I would like to hear each of you, both Joseph and Jeff, talk about who you perceive your audiences to be and how the message changes based on who it is that you're speaking to. Because I think a lot of folks in the room here are thinking about that a lot. You know, who are they writing for? Who are they podcasting for? You know, who are they trying to reach, and how does the message change depending on who it is that you're reaching?
I can jump first. So part of the problem is oftentimes when we do talks like this or when we write papers, it's to the audience that already agrees with us. So I'm trying to get inside the rooms of folks that have zero awareness, zero knowledge, and don't think it's an issue at all, right? The climate deniers are the ones I'm trying to talk to. The folks that think they can't fight back are the ones I'm trying to talk to. So the message changed for them and how serious they need to take it. But typically when I'm talking, it's to other scientists, which is part of the issue, is that we're all in agreement. Most, like 97% of scientists agree climate change is a real thing. The other 3%, I believe, are getting paid by oil companies. We can argue about that, but they're making money off of disagreeing, right? Most people, the data shows it, statistics show it. We all know it's happening, it's getting worse. But what I like to tell people is that individually, when you talk to someone about their impacts, that's when they care. So if I tell you this place that you used to live and go visit for your childhood over the summer is going to be underwater in the next 100 years or 50 years, and your grandkids won't see it or your kids won't see it, then people care. Or if I tell you the place where you fish, all the fish you normally go to fish for are no longer going to be there because they can't inhabit that area, or all the animals are not going to be there that you normally see when you go to the zoo or what have you because they can't live in that climate anymore. That's when people start to care. Or when I say, your bill's going to go up an extra $100 because you're going to be cranking that AC or that heat because of the temperature changes, then people start to care when it hits their bottom line. So a lot of times when I talk to people, I don't tell them, oh, this is the amount of deaths we're going to see. I tell them this is the amount of billions of dollars you're going to lose due to climate change. So from fires alone, we're already seeing on average between 10 billion and 100 billion, depending on what year it is, damages. And so that's a lot of loss, right? That's billion with a B for those who didn't catch it. So it's a lot of money. And this is one source alone due to climate change, right? And so if you add all the other sources, or the enhancing of tornadoes, the enhancements of hurricanes, the enhancements of blah, 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 water quality is another whole issue in itself. You have all these different impacts that are widespread. Like, this is the way you communicate with people, is when you tell them in your neighborhood in the next 5 years, not 20 years from now, not 30 years, next 5 years, this is what you're going to see. How do you learn to live with that condition here's the way you could, or you can do something now to fight that. That's where I talk to people.
And Jeff, your audience?
Interesting. So I guess I see it in two ways. One is that in this book and other books of mine, I directly say that I'm not interested in having the conversation about, does CO2 warm the planet? Is burning fossil fuels responsible for this? I mean, I just am not interested in engaging in that level of the debate. There are lots of people who are really good at that, and I think it's really important to reach out to that. People like Catherine Heo and others who kind of specialize in being able to talk to, this large segment of America who just thinks it's something that George Soros and the guys at Davos are plotting in order to, assert some kind of control over our lives, or some microchip implanted somewhere or something. I'm not interested in engaging on that level. But I am interested in engaging on the level of people like myself who think they know something about climate but don't really. I mean, I've been writing about climate for 20 years, full time. I've written 7 books, and I still don't get it, I feel. I mean, no, I'm serious. I mean, the implications of what we're doing by putting CO2 in the atmosphere and the cascading effects of this are so enormous and so profound and so far-reaching that, and I don't hold myself up as any kind of model. I'm just a guy who has spent 20 years doing his best to learn about this. I still don't get it. And I'll tell you an example of that is the genesis of this book. I had the idea for this book 5 years ago when I was in Phoenix and it was 115 degrees and I was there for a meeting. And I walked out of my hotel. I had to walk 15 blocks to where I was going to meet this woman. And by the time I got those 15 blocks, my heart was pounding. I was feeling dizzy. I was like, oh my God, if I had to go another 15 blocks, I don't know what would happen. I mean, obviously I wasn't going to die on the streets of Phoenix, but I was going to faint or something. And it occurred to me right then that at that time, I'd been writing about climate change for 15 years. Heat was hardly a secret. I mean, global warming kind of gives you a hint that heat's involved somehow. But I had never really thought about the actual implications of heat on a living thing, myself or anyone else. And that was when I thought, oh, I should maybe think about this a little bit, and maybe there's more to this than I understand. And that was sort of the genesis of the book. And furthermore, I had been writing about climate change for 15 years, and if you'd have asked me that day, what is heat? I couldn't have told you. I could have told you what temperature was, but what is heat? Is it like some invisible thing that flows out of the sky? Is it some weird liquid that I can't quite see? Is it like some light ray that, is it something, what is it? I couldn't have told you. So I think that our ignorance about what is happening is profound, even the most educated of us. And I feel like my job as a writer that I try to do in my own small way with these books is to fill in that gap in some small way and to help paint this larger picture. And this is why, I know this is long-winded, but I'll end with, this is why I think climate journalism is such a great field to get into right now, because the work that journalists like myself and Dan and so many other people have done on this is just the beginning. We're just beginning to understand both the science, the politics, the cultural, the social justice. I mean, there's so much of it that is just, we don't, the story is, we haven't even written the first paragraph of this big story yet. And so there's so much to learn and so much to write about. And so I feel like my audience is filling in these little gaps.
So I want to jump in. So who here has boiled water before? Yeah, everybody, right? So this is the simple way to explain climate change to folks. It usually takes quite a bit of time to boil that one little pot of water on the stove, right? So 5 to 7 minutes typically to get it to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Now imagine that the earth is covered with 70% of water, give or take. We're raising the temperature of the water on the globe. This is how much impact we are. And so this is how much the temperature is impacting things. And once you raise that temperature, fish can't live anymore. Chlorophyll can't live anymore. Things are starting to be impacted. We're changing the way the ocean flows. Like, that's insane. This is how bad it's getting. And this is why I tell people we have to start paying attention and wake up. Because if we're changing the currents of the ocean, we're changing the currents of the winds, this is unheard of. This is something that is very serious. As they say, the famous story about the frog in the pot of water, right? It sits in there because it thinks everything's fine as it slowly heats up. And then eventually it gets to boiling temperature and the frog eventually dies. We are the frog. I don't want to be the frog. So help me fight being the frog. And so let's get out of this boiling pot, 'cause we can't go to Mars. I always tell people this. It sounds cool. It sounds good. Thank you, people are trying to get us there. But I don't know about you, but I don't want to sit 4 years in a space shuttle to hope I can pray and find the same stuff we have here. Doesn't make any sense to me. So, yeah.
Is there a question?
Hi, my name is Flavia. I'm an international environmental lawyer. Thank you so much for organizing this panel. I have a question for Dr. Joseph Wilkins. So I actually have two, but since there's a lot of questions, I'm just going to ask one. There's this principle in international environmental law and climate change law, which is the common but differentiated responsibilities, which touches upon historical responsibility. And my question is, within the US border, so at the national level here, because I'm not really aware of the framework here, is there such a principle that tries to, make responsible and make pay those that are more responsible for this climate crisis and help for adaptation measures for those that are being the most affected and that are not so responsible for it? Thank you.
Jeff, you wrote about attribution science. I didn't know that there was this real-time attribution science that's coming out. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
And, the legal implications there.
Yeah.
Tremendous.
They are tremendous. And I think that there's, a lot happening right now in the legal world with this question of responsibility. We saw it in the recent court decision in Montana, where a number of young people in Montana sued the state for, basically violating a statute in the Montana Constitution, guaranteeing a sort of a safe climate, a safe world for them to grow up in, and they argued that climate change is, destroying that. And there's many, lots of litigation around the world that is dealing with exactly this. But directly to your question, I don't think there's anything codified in the sort of law in the United States that I'm aware of that really talks about this, except these emerging cases. But what's happening that's interesting and exciting and is going to push this forward is this attribution science question, which is, until very recently, when there was an extreme climate event, whether it was a hurricane or a heat wave or a drought, scientists would use some version of what Jim Hansen said a decade or so ago, that, what climate does, warming does, is load the dice to make these events more likely. He would use this analogy of the loaded dice. And you can't say that any one thing, you can't say, oh, this heat wave was caused by the higher CO2 levels, but it made it more likely. And that was the gist of a lot of the kind of trying to attribute events to higher CO2 levels. But this new emerging science of attribution science, and I write about a German scientist named Friederike Otto, who's at the forefront of this, have been able to use these sophisticated modeling to actually say, no, this event can be attributed to climate change. And the Pacific Northwest heat wave I talk about in my book is a great example of this, where they basically said that this heat wave would not have happened without the higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, creating the link between CO2 and these events. And a lot of people have drawn the analogies of tobacco, like that we're finally able to say something close, not an exact parallel. There are differences we could go into if you want, but there are differences, but it's still the idea that this event was just as lung cancer was caused by smoking cigarettes, this heat wave was caused by additional CO2 in the atmosphere. Not every event they've shown is that. They did a similar thing with the floods in Pakistan last year, and they basically said, no, this was in the range of natural variability. So it's really interesting because, it's not just a blanket, everything was caused by, but they're able to precisely point this out. And what's important about this is this opens the door to all kinds of questions about legal responsibility, damages. In the UN framework, there's this question of loss and damages. The people who caused this, whether you look at it by nations or by corporations, or you say ExxonMobil, or you say United States or in Europe, or however you want to divide it up, were responsible for this problem, for these events, this suffering. What do they owe to the people who are bearing the brunt of this suffering? And that, I think, is changing the politics of climate change in a big way, because it's opening the door to a lot of these suits. I think there's like 240 of them around the world right now. And, it's beginning to make this link of responsibility and accountability for this. And then when you add the fact, and I'll end this, the parallels with tobacco is very clear in the sense of disinformation, misleading, deliberately undermining the science. We know now that the oil companies knew from the 70s, have spent billions of dollars greenwashing, deliberately confusing the science. What do they owe now for all that? How do we hold them accountable? And I think that's politically one of the most interesting questions that's emerging in the world of climate politics right now.
Yeah, I'll jump in to add some additional context. So there's a very scientific answer to that, and it's very simple as well as complex. It's how much time you got. So meaning with how much time you got is we can trace back almost every single thing that happened scientifically speaking, if you give me enough time to look into it, to research it, to sort it out. And there's a place that I used to work at called the Environmental Protection Agency that does just that. And so, yes. So the EPA does this, right? And it's called Exceptional Events Demonstration, to where if your air quality in your city is above a certain level, they research why it is, right? So they'll look in to see, okay, it's this power plant contribute this much, this fire contributed that much, this, you got a bus depot right here. So we can actually trace back each source and how much each source contributes to what you're experiencing, whether that's an oil spill, whether that's a train that went off, derailed, and it's spilling things into your water. We can look all these things up through science, through measurements, through key research. So it's possible. It's just very, very expensive, and it's laborsome. So it's often not done. And there's also this thing called Superfund sites. So look that up. And these are areas that are already designated as pretty much non-livable. And people live there. So oftentimes the government is putting a lot of money and effort and time to fix it, essentially, and they put time limits on how long it takes to fix these areas. So yeah, this is a good question, and it's something that can be done. It's just, it's laborsome and it's costly, and you have to take key researchers from what they're trying to do to spend time on that. And that's the issue it is, because a lot of times people are trying to work on predicting the next thing, as opposed to using retrospective studies to research what has already happened. And so a community typically has to lobby for that to happen in order for it to work. And oftentimes communities don't even know this exists. So this is something you can educate your constituents on, is to say you can fight back by just contacting your alderman, your local political person, or going over their head to the actual departments of whatever it is, whether it's Department of Defense, Department of Energy, EPA, what have you, and say, hey, we have an issue here. I know it exists. Look into it, please. And then they can do that. And they can say it's these people's fault, because companies, like you mentioned earlier, are very smart. So if you look at a lot of cities, for example, they place the power points on the edge of the state. You know why? Because they know which way the wind's going to blow. All the pollution is going to blow into the next state. So it's not our fault. We're very clean. It's because our people are okay, but we're screwing the people downwind up. The people downwind can't do anything other than just breathe the air we're giving them. Same thing as dumping it in the water. Look at the Ohio River. It starts all the way up in the upper parts of Pennsylvania. People are dumping things all the way down. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, so we have about 7-8 states dumping stuff into our water before it gets to us. Can we fix it? No. We'd have to argue with each one of those states, each one of those cities on that waterway, and that's very difficult to do. And so,
I know who I'm leaving my money to now. All of it. It's a lot, believe me. Kyle.
Hi, I'm Kylie. My question is for both of you. What do you do in situations where you're either reporting on or working with communities that are suffering from the effects of climate change, but are also somewhat of denialists and don't maybe agree with the science that you're either presenting them or the article that you're working on?
Well, I mean, when you say what do you do about it, I mean, you know, my job as a journalist and your job as a journalist, presuming you're a journalist, is not to change their minds per se while you're reporting it. It's to report, you know, what is happening. So I've spent a lot of time in places where I live in a place, Texas, where there's a lot of people who think that climate change is, you know, a scam to shut down the oil industry, or, you know, I mean, there's all kinds of different explanations for why we shouldn't take it seriously. And it's also the belly of the beast for climate change. We have sea level rise, we have hurricanes, we have extreme heat waves. I mean, I would argue that there's probably no place in America that's more vulnerable to climate change impacts than Texas. But, you know, as a reporter, it's not my job to, like, as I'm reporting the story, to try to change anybody's mind about it. It's my job to report that interesting kind of, you know, disconnect between, you know, you go to this town and you talk to these people and they think it's a hoax, and yet their house is, you know, been washed away in the hurricane, or their grandmother just died of a heat stroke, and yet they still don't acknowledge that maybe we should, you know, move quickly away from fossil fuels. I mean, that's the story, right? I mean, it's like, how you capture that in the most compelling way is the art of journalism, right? Of how do you make that story compelling without obviously ridiculing or belittling these people, or minimizing the disconnect, right? And that's what makes climate journalism so fascinating, is that you have these radical disconnects that are part of the story, and you have to report that, and you have to find a way to write about it that does justice to that. And you know, so I don't think there's any other way kind of to deal with it other than like head on that way.
So briefly, the problem with Jeff's answer is that it's the same as my answer would be. We just report, right? So I report the data, I report the facts, statistics, and we don't give any type of personal opinions in what we do.
Excuse me. Yes, I do.
Well, that's the difference.
I give serious.
I just don't have personal opinions.
Right, you're a scientist.
Yeah.
I'm not.
So I'm supposed to be
I rant and
objective.
rave, all kinds
Yeah.
of things. Yeah.
That's why we need more journalists. Again, please help us. So you do a really good job with that. But on our side of it, it's purely just we can't go outside the data, because the second you do, the second you add your personal feelings, the second you discredit yourself as a scientist. And so I spent the better part of over a decade becoming that. I don't want to lose that over one paper that I write that has my personal opinion on it or what I think may happen. And so that's the benefit of a journalist, is that you can add a little bit of that to it to say the science is leaning towards this direction. We can't really say that. We can say it's here. This is what it is. If it's 10 or 5, that's the number. This is what I assume means that number, but this is what the number actually is. So the problem is, whether you believe it or not, I can tell you what it is and what's happening and how long it will happen to you. What you do with that information is up to you, which is why I'm now doing panels, right? Because I'm like, hey, you guys, we got the numbers, but nobody's listening. So that's the question earlier, right? And so now the fight goes to, where are those people that don't believe? What do they need to hear to make them believe? And that's where I think journalists come in. Like, the book is awesome. That's a good tool to reach people that I would never reach. No one's going to read my journals on Google Scholar. Like, I don't think anyone in this room has, right? Maybe, oh, cool, couple, woohoo. Yes. So, but I didn't see many hands go up, right? And so that's actually where a lot of the science is, in places where most people won't reach it. So this is why the power of journalism comes into play, and that's why we need everyone who can actually communicate these things. You know, a lot of scientists aren't sitting on these panels. A lot of us don't do this. I'm still new to it. I've only done this for a couple of years. And so in terms of communicating on panels, but I've been researching for decades. And so this is often the problem, is that the people who know the stuff don't communicate it. The people who are communicating are trying to get it from the people who don't want to communicate.
But you do get personal a little bit, and because you have said, I heard you say it before, and you said it tonight to me too, or no, to the group, that you have asthma and that you got into this field. Tell us why.
Yeah, so the problem is I can't put that in the paper, right? But I got into this field because I'm a person who grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, which, if you don't know, it's a place called Rubber Town. So about 30 to 60 active chemical treatment plants, waste treatment plants, and rubber plants are all right there in one area. I grew up probably 5 minutes from it. So the reason why I liked weather so much is I used to see which way the plume was blowing, and I used to be like, oh, that's the wind direction. We know which way to throw the football. You know which way to hit the baseball, right? So growing up with asthma, my mother used to literally say, you can't go outside today, and it'd be a beautiful hot day. And I'd be like, Mom, you're full of you know what? You know, I didn't say it that way to her, of course. But I was thinking that. I'm like, Mom, it's like 90 degrees outside, not a cloud in the sky. What do you mean I can't go outside? But she was worried about my health. Because she's like, if you go outside and run around playing football, wrestling with your friends or your cousins, you might actually die or have an asthma attack, right? And so she was more cognizant of that at an early age because she had a kid who had to be. And so this is often the case, and where you live at can give you things like asthma. Like I tell folks, when I left to go to grad school in St. Louis, it was the first time I took a deep breath. You know, first time I was able to feel like I breathe. And St. Louis is not a clean city by any stretch of imagination, but it was cleaner than Louisville. So in retrospective speaking, I didn't have sinus infections anymore. I didn't have to rely on an inhaler, albuterol, breathing machines, all this stuff. I got to move just because of where I lived. And so I moved to a cleaner place. And so this is something that I try to tell folks, and it's my why, is all I tell people, because I still have asthma, but I live in cleaner cities and cleaner areas because I know where to go, because the data tells me where I can live, right? A lot of people aren't living this way.
And you know people who've died as a result of
Yeah.
pollution.
Oh yeah, no, thousands of people, and mostly.
I mean, we all do, but
Yeah.
I think maybe you know a lot, or you've
Yeah.
really thought deeply about it.
Yeah, part of it is part of the job, to where I have to look at it every day. So the amount of people that are dying, I try to not personalize it, but I study deaths literally all day. I study what I call it morbidity, mortality, so everything that almost kills you to everything that kills you. So I'm working with epidemiologists, health scientists, I'm in the hospitals, and we're looking at, on a large scale across the CONUS, which continental U.S., about where are those people at, where are those pockets of people, how often are they dying, how frequent. So when I'm throwing out these numbers of millions of deaths, thousands of deaths, blah, 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 these causes, I'm actually seeing the individual hospitals these people are passing at. And so it weighs on you a bit, but you also have to numb yourself to it in sorts, to where you can do your job, right? And so when I go to talk to people like this, I can be as emotional as I want. But when I report it, I have to say, okay, we just had 6,000 deaths in this city. This is what it was. I can't be like, oh, 6,000 individual families lost a person. It's a brother, a mother, sister, auntie, cousin, kid. These are real people. And we're just reporting. This is yearly numbers I'm talking about. Millions of people each year. Like, we're talking from fires alone, from purely just smoke, 6,000 to 12,000 each year, right? That's a lot of people that's just gone off the planet because they breathed it. Yeah, so that's one thing that I have to deal with. So thank you for that.
Thanks for answering.
Yeah, just a quick observation. Your content has been so fantastic that we have a long line of people asking questions, and where the time is running by. So I think we'll have to
30.
switch to probably shorter questions and answers, because you guys have been so fantastic. So with that,
You can tell we talk too much.
Next.
Kind way of saying it.
Okay, yeah, I have a short question. By the way, my name is Faye. I'm really interested in the science of climate change. And like you mentioned, these anti-climate people, they have a lot of excuses, and I just want your opinion on one of the excuses, and that climate change is like a natural progress and that we're overreacting. I can give an example. So throughout Earth's history, even before human beings existed, we know there are evidence that in Earth, there are periods of time when Earth got really, really hot, and then there are periods of time Earth got really, really cold, like the Ice Age. And these happened, even before human existed. So, what's your opinion on one of the counter argument that climate change is just a natural progress?
Okay, I just want to say climate science and, yeah, the climate emergency that we're in right now, thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate it. But it's accepted science. So, as science and health and environmental journalists, this is where we tend to go. Yeah, there are these counter theories that have been completely disproved over and over and over still recur. How much time do we want to spend? It's important,
I'll say a
right?
simple answer. The simple answer is yes, that is true. Everything on this planet happens in cycles. There's ups, there's downs. There's ice age, then there's heat waves, right? The issue is we are no longer on geologic time frames. So look up this word, Anthropocene. This is the age of human intervention. We are the #1 cause of change on this planet now, and we have been for the last 40, 50 years, easily detectable. Previously, the Earth went through different geological. So think about the time frame of a rock to make a change, and for the rock to go through its formation. If you come by with a hammer and smash that rock, you have now changed that rock forever on a time frame that it normally wouldn't have. That's essentially how you would explain that to someone in a very simple way. So that's what we're doing to the planet.
Did you want to comment?
I'll just say really quickly that, I find this argument, I hear it all the time, and I find it infuriating. It's just like, really? People have always died, and it doesn't mean that, you can't drive your Tesla into a telephone pole and die, too. Just because the Earth has changed before, it doesn't mean that CO2 is not accelerating that change. Both things can be true, right? It's like the notion that because the Earth changed before, we can't be responsible for that change now is just a kind of, shall I say, deeply problematic logic.
And before the next one. The problem is we're heading to a place to where all the cycles on the Earth are no longer what they resembled before. That's the biggest issue. We're hitting to that, remember that precipice of the old crap point? Once we hit that, all the things we've seen before, all the things we measured before will become irrelevant. We'll be in a new regime, and that's the problem.
Next question?
Hi, thanks so much for coming. Whenever I talk to researchers that do either heat research or air pollution, I hear this complaint that we reporters sometimes put too much effort in the acute effects of this phenomenon instead of the chronic effects, which I think it makes a lot. We talk a lot about asthma hospitalizations, but not about dementia and air pollution, or heat stroke, and not about kidney disease or other things that are linked to heat. So yeah, I would like to know what do you think about it, and if there's one way around it.
I was going to say the acute effects is what actually is going to get people to listen. So like I mentioned earlier, if you're going to miss work 7 to 10 extra days because of climate change, that might actually make you care more, especially if you're a person who gets paid for actually showing up to work. Not all of us are salaried, right? Some people are hourly workers, and if you have asthma, you got to go to the hospital. You might not have insurance. That could be really impactful for you. So talking about those type of things, I think will actually impact way more people than me saying, yeah, you might knock off 5 years from your life. You're like, I don't know when I'm going to die. I don't care. So if you tell people, okay, you're going to miss an extra $1,000 because you missed 10 hours or whatever you make, whatever. I think people care more about that. So keep up the work with the acute effects. Yeah.
Well, I just think it has to do with the, complexity of what we're talking about here. And as a journalist, you have to pick out, I wrote a 400-page book about heat, and I missed 90% of the story, right? Or I left out 90% of the story. You have to choose what you think is important and what will capture your attention of your audience and best tell that story. So if it means, focusing on, mortality, acute effects, the fact that people will drop dead on a 2-hour hike in the Sierras, like I talked about, that gets people's attention. And as a journalist, your job is to balance this out with also talking about the longer term effects. And it depends on what you're doing and what the context is and what kind of journalism you're doing. It's different if you're doing a 3-minute NBC News report about extreme heat than if you're writing a 400-page book about extreme heat, or if you're doing, a blog post or something like that, or, you're writing an article for Time Magazine or something. This is all about journalistic judgments also.
Question?
So the climate week. So I understand. So last week I was out marching in Wall Street, and it's because we seen that we had 150 people got arrested at the Wall Street, and then last week Tuesday we got 12, 13 people got arrested at the Bank of America in Upper West in the Midtown Manhattan. So the thing, here's the thing, and so the thing. So here's the thing. So we have another action coming up in this fall. We don't know when. So excuse me. So we don't know when. Okay. So and then the thing and so we went to. So you look at the clock at 14th Street, Union Square. It's told you how long we're going to save the earth, and we don't know how we're going to get the next zero by 2050. How are we going to get the next zero? And what year it's going to be in? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking a lot about these demonstrations and protests, and I think it's important to think about, how transformative are they? Do we, like you said, Jeff, do we have to go from 50,000 to 500,000 to 5 million people in the street?
I bet the 1.5 warning.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I just want to say one thing about this idea. I mean, I think it's a great question. And this, I feel like the climate conversation has been hijacked and kind of contorted by this idea of tipping points and this idea that, once we cross the 1.5 threshold, we're doomed. Or once we cross the 2 degree of warming threshold, we're doomed. And this is a very dangerous idea because it gives people the feeling that if we don't do, net zero by 2050, we're all just going to, there's no point. We all should just hang out and party and, the end is near. That's not how it works. Everything that we do, every ton of CO2 we keep out of the atmosphere keeps the warming, reduces the warming. Every action that we take to build cooler, more sustainable cities, every V8 engine we get off the road and replace with electric vehicle, everything that we do makes a difference. And there's not this invisible line where, we cross it and we're all fucked, right? I mean, that's not how the climate system works, and that's not how the political system works. And I fear that a lot of this deadline stuff has fed into this notion of some kind of invisible line that we will cross. And there is no invisible line. It's a constant fight, and everything we do matters in an extremely important way.
So yeah, newsflash for those who don't know, we likely won't get to net zero anything by any year. Just in case you were keeping score. But the thing is, I like your point, which I like to tell people about the old crap point, but the old crap point just means just that. We'll hit a point where we won't know what's going to happen, but we will still be here in that oh crap status, right? And so what that means is that could be anywhere between we need to go to underground bunkers because we can't breathe, which mammals have done before, similar to our size, where they hide in caves and blah, blah, blah to survive. That could be a huge extreme. I don't think we're getting there. But it could just be where we have to genetically modify plants to survive. We're already doing that now to some degree. We have to do geoengineering to where we have to cloud seed, things like that. We're already doing some of these things now. Are these the conditions in which you want to live under? That's really what the question is. The question isn't, are we going to be here? The question is it going to be too hot for me to go visit my family in the north? Because it's no longer, the temperature's changed, right? I don't have a way to deal with the heat waves in Canada or something like that. So I don't want to go up there when it's summertime. So those are the things that's going to be in the next 100 years, truthfully. Or will Miami be underwater in 100 years? Will it be, I won't be able to go to South Beach anymore. Things like that is really what we're dealing with. Not will we all just magically just cease to exist. I mean, that could happen if the climate hit us, but anyways. But it likely won't be the case. We'll still be here suffering. And our plants are already suffering from the ability to grow. Like we're having less corn yield, less soybean yield. And so that's going to impact us too, right? Because of the way the air quality is mixed with the way the heat is, the growing patterns are going to change. Fire season, for example, used to be mostly June, July. August was the height of it. Now the height is expanding, and it's almost year-round that we're going to have to deal with fire smoke. So this is really what we're talking about when we talk about the changes, is that there's just things we haven't had to deal with before. So.
Hi, my name is Noah Augustine. I'm 15 years old, and I have a question for Mr. Goodall, and I have to say Mr. Goodall because I happen to be too young to call you by your first name.
You are not too young.
And Mr.
Trust me.
Wilkins. Mr. Goodall, you spoke about the thermal divide, both in your book and here today, and Mr. Wilkins, you spoke about the smoke divide, and I want to ask if either of you have any ideas on solutions to these divides in terms of racial injustice and also class injustice. Thank you.
Well, you know, I mean, that's the big question. I mean, what are those solutions? That is the issue that we face in the whole, you know, what do we do about the climate crisis right now? And so there's, you know, when it comes to heat, there's lots of things that can be done. You know, democratizing air conditioning. Air conditioning is not a silver bullet for extreme heat. I could go on forever about the problems of air conditioning.
There's a whole chapter on air
Yes,
conditioning.
there is
It's
a whole
fascinating.
chapter about air conditioning that I'm
These
very
Texas guys invented it. It's amazing, and they're fighting with each other.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by air conditioning, and you know, like I said, I'm like, I have to be careful not to derail the entire night to a long rant about air conditioning, but you know, we can do things like democratize air conditioning, you know, make it cheaper to run, get it to more people so that they're less vulnerable. Things like, you know, simple things like, you know, planting more trees in lower income neighborhoods. We were talking about earlier about urban trees and the divide between wealthy and poor neighborhoods. You know, and that's just on heat, public spaces to allow people who don't have access to cooling in hot places to go to. I live in Austin, where we have a big swimming hole called Barton Springs, and it's very cheap, and on hot days it's free, and it's just jammed with people, and you know, their bodies sizzle as they jump in the water because it's so hot. But having places like that allow access to cooling spaces are really important in rethinking cities so that there isn't a thermal divide built into the cities the way they are now. So there's, you know, a long list of things that can be done. But the most important thing that can be done is to stop burning fossil fuels so that this divide does not keep widening, so that these temperature increases and fires and all the things we're talking about don't accelerate. And the more that we can, you know, reduce these impacts or limit these impacts, the narrower that divide will be. But as I said before, I think that all writing about climate change now should be in the context of your question exactly. What do we do about this divide? What are the solutions that we have? How do we address this? And that should be, in my view, the frame for all thinking about this issue right now.
So I'll speak briefly. As I don't know much about journalism, but the thing I do know is you don't put the answer in the question. That's kind of what you did. You didn't notice it, though. So by saying you're 15, you literally are telling us the solution to it. The youth is the answer, because eventually you'll take over running this world, your generation. And you'll have more knowledge, you'll have more wherewithal, and you'll have the care to do what's right, right? So most people who my age and older kind of stuck in the ways, right? We're going to live the way we live. And it's going to just be like, oh, you folks have to live with it, you deal with it, and there's going to be a few of us that talk about it. But you have the chance of time on your hands, because you're going to be the ones ultimately inheriting this, right? We're giving you all these problems. So the solution is simply just look at what we've already, because like Jeff mentioned, there's a bunch of different things you can do. We know about all the things you can do. We just need the implementation to be done. That's the problem. No one wants to implement any of these solutions. So I can tell you all of them till we're blue in the face, but if no one does it, you see what I'm saying? So I'm glad you said that. So yeah, 15 is a great age to get active into this, seriously.
Yeah, this is Noah's, at least your second Kavli conversation, right? Yeah. It's great that you're here, thanks. Question?
Hi. Yeah, my question will follow up nicely to that one, I think. And this is a question that's mostly for you, Jeff, but also I'm curious in hearing both of your thoughts on this. So I, like many people in this room, cover climate and environment. And the more that I learn and the more that I report, the more dread and just extreme sorrow I feel. So Jeff, I can't even imagine after 20 years how this has weighed on you. But one thing that the climate activists and other protesters out at the march on a couple Sundays ago were saying, and I was out there with a colleague of mine in our class covering that, was that they've turned to rage, they've turned to anger, and that's something that I have been thinking about a lot in our reporting, and whether that is a lens that we should be exploring in our reporting with our sources in the way that we frame things as we move forward to kind of get at this idea of how do we, how do we reach people better? So I'm curious to know both of your thoughts on I guess this trend that I've been witnessing and hearing about toward anger and away from kind of the passive we're sad about this lens.
I think as a journalist, I feel like it's my job not to police emotions about like what the correct response should be to this, whether it's sadness or apathy or rage. I mean, that is part of the story, right? And I understand rage. I understand people who are angry about this. I'm angry about this, and that's part of the narrative. I think that the question as a journalist is, how do you tell that story? And how do you explain that rage? And how do you construct, characters and narratives and, frame it in a way that is compelling and interesting and new, and not just like, Jeff's angry about all what all the rich white guys did to the planet. Poor Jeff, look at him suffer. I mean, that's not a really great piece of journalism. But exploring the depths of the anger and making that anger intelligible and making that anger feel real. It's not any different than journalists have to do on other things. One of my favorite stories I ever wrote was about, this was before I started writing about climate change, so it was like 21 years ago. I wrote a story for the New York Times Magazine about a man at the Oklahoma City bombing that blew up I don't know if you remember, but it was in the late 90s. A guy bombed the FBI federal building in Oklahoma City. And I wrote a story about a man who lost his wife. His wife was killed in this bombing. And Timothy McVeigh, the guy who did it, there was a big debate about whether he should be executed or not. And this man, I wrote a story about him because he came out and decided that he thought Timothy McVeigh should not be executed, and that he had forgiveness for him. But it was a story about the journey of this man's rage and sorrow and pain and then coming to forgiveness. And I think that there's that, not that climate activists are coming to forgiveness, but understanding and articulating this emotion rather than just stating it is what our job as journalists is. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So, as a scientist who's used to people going to sleep when I talk, I'm happy for any emotion, especially the anger. Feed me with your anger, please. And so, because mostly strong emotions lead to strong actions, and that's what we need, right? We don't need people sitting idly aside. If you've seen in many different movements, motivated, strong allyship is what leads to the cause to be pushed forward. And so that's really what we need. So whatever emotion you want to have, obviously within reason, I think it's good. And anger is usually a pretty natural emotion for most people. And so usually when you first become aware of anything, even with the first 5 stages of death, right? You've seen all this. It's usually an anger response is the first response. So that's fine. We just got to curtail that anger to a respectable way that actually is helpful. Yeah. So feed the anger.
And the teacher in me wants to tell you, trust that instinct you have that you're seeing a transformation from anxiety to anger. Go there, mind that, because you're onto a story and a way of thinking about this. You should pursue that.
Yes, please. Good call.
Next, please.
Hi. So, having worked in this field for a pretty long time and a time period wherein the concept of climate change has become a lot more broadly accepted, but also a lot more political, and there's been a lot of polarization over it. How have you seen changes in the way that your work has been received, and how do you see that, kind of influence in the future, in terms of climate journalism and climate research, like what the future of those fields looks like?
So I'll answer this first. Politicizing climate change is stupid. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. And so, okay, so as a person who worked for the federal government for some years, it's really difficult to do your job when it's political. So for example, when I was working at the Environmental Protection Agency, I literally couldn't use the word climate change in any of my work. I couldn't use the word global warming in any of my work.
Years?
I was there from 2016 through 2020. Yeah. And so you can kind of guess who was president then, right? So, but part of the problem is, let's take it back from personal opinions on whoever the president is. So you have President, this is what I tell people, President 45 came in, right? But the president before that, we got into I try not to politicize it. Sorry. We got into the Paris agreements, right? And so the Paris Agreements was a climate change around the whole globe getting together, the United States leading the way. EPA is one of the leading people who know about air quality and climate and all that stuff. We got into this agreement with a bunch of different countries to help out saving the planet. Next president comes in, removes us from those agreements, politically speaking, right? So now we have to stop all that work. And if you know anything about science, taking off 4 to 5 or whatever years of scientific research, shutting down climate change studies, is very troublesome. And then you have the next president comes in, and we start all things back up. Science doesn't work this way. So you've lost several critical years of research, several critical years of scientists. You've lost person power, when you say it that way, to where people got fired, removed from their jobs, and we have to find these people again, hope they still want to do the job years later. And it's just, we need to get policy out of this because it has nothing to do with policy. So that's my...
Well, I will respectfully disagree with you in the context of, I think it's all about politics, right? I mean, because data is one thing, doing the work of science is one thing, but really the data is what, the question is, what do we do about it, right? And that is inherently political, right? So I don't think that in the policy world we're ever going to depoliticize this. In the science world, politics influences what you can study and what you can say, but in the world of what we can do about this is an inherently political question because it involves trade-offs, strategies, money, all kinds of things. And that's part of the problem of this, is that politics is woven deeply into this conversation. It's not, I wish it were rational. I wish it was just like, oh, look, we're burning fossil fuels, the planet's getting hot, it's causing all these problems that you have studied and done so much great work to help us understand. Let's stop burning fossil fuels. So that would be a fairly simple, wonderful way if we would solve this problem, which we sort of did with the ozone hole, right? Yeah. But we cannot manage to do that with fossil fuels and climate change because of all the politics and money and everything. But I just want to say one other thing about how it's changed. When I've made this joke before, so, but it's really true. When I started writing about climate change 20 years ago, it was like I was writing about the sex life of porcupines. It was like some funny little niche that I happened to like. I haven't written that book yet. that'll be the sequel.
Gotta read this one.
But it was like this weird little niche that Jeff had some weird interest in and somehow found fascinating, and no one really paid any attention. And now, this book was on the bestseller list for a month, and everywhere I go, people want to talk to me about where should I move, where should I invest, am I going to die, it's like I'm a very popular guy now. Well, no, but it's not about me. It's about how the conversation has changed, and the conversation now has become from this niche sex life of porcupines conversation to the everything conversation, and that's why it's such a great field for journalism, is because it's impacting all kinds of things that we have not thought about before, from economics to tourism to health. I mean, it's just in this ever expanding story.
Young man? This is my spouse.
Hey, Steve.
Really? Uh-oh. We better be.
Science journalist Steve Mirsky.
Hey, Steve.
The answer, by the way, is very carefully.
What?
The sex life of porcupine. So there's a guy, his name rhymes with Flomborg.
Yeah.
And he's a big hero to a lot of people who think that this is not an issue, it's not a problem. And he's been going around the world telling people more people actually die from cold than from heat. Therefore, if we warm the planet up, it's going to actually save lives. And I looked up the numbers, and son of a gun, more people do die from cold. So where is the lie in that? Because I know that he's not telling the full truth.
Okay, well, so Bjorn Lomborg is a notorious figure, as you've pointed out, and he's very skillful at how he frames these questions. And it's absolutely, if you look at it in the way that he frames it, yes, more people die of cold than heat. But there's many, many caveats to this, which I could go into for a long time, and we don't have time for that. But the short version of it is, first of all, it's comparing apples to oranges. Heat deaths are very acute. You are, like the family that I wrote about, you die quickly. Cold deaths can linger for, you get colds, pneumonias, things like this that can take weeks and months. They accumulate over time. The question of where do you draw the line between a cold day and a hot day is very kind of arbitrary. If you say anything below 50 degrees is cold, or 45 degrees, and the same with heat, where you put the markers for what you call heat and cold can impact these numbers hugely. Third of all, it's a terrible kind of death arbitrage, like, Uncle Fred, died of a heat stroke, but Aunt Sally, she didn't freeze, so it's okay that Uncle Fred died. It's like, we're sorry, but Aunt Sally's happy, and so that's a weird kind of thing. And then the fact is that as the climate warms, these extreme events, these extreme heat events especially, are happening in particular parts of the world. As you mentioned earlier, the world is not warming at a uniform rate. And so you're going to see enormous numbers of deaths in places as the heat rises that are going to accelerate this unequalness between the sort of cooled and the damned that I talked about. So there's all kinds of racial and social justice issues. And the final thing is that our world is getting hotter, not colder. So we are going to see an acceleration of heat deaths anyway. And whether you compare it to cold deaths or cancer or, people slipping on ice or whatever you want to call it, we are still going to see an acceleration of heat deaths. We're going to see an acceleration of vulnerability and an acceleration of this thermal divide until we get our act together and stop burning fossil fuels.
So I have a very simple one word: integrity. Right? So as a scientist or a person who studies data, facts, and statistics, we all know you can skew those data, facts, and statistics very easily. Right? I can go in my computer models and I can click a couple different buttons and change things and tell you that that's what it is. But we are trained and taught not to do this. And so anyone who does that is kind of being academically and honest, right? Like, you're looking at data set, you can skew it to say whatever you want, which is how those energy sector folks got away with it for so many years, which is what he mentioned earlier. And this is what the scary part is. This is how you can confuse people easily. I can make a graph and show you anything. I can make a graph and show you CO2 is lowering. In some places it might, right? I can show you that air quality is getting better as a whole, because it technically is. But the background is getting worse, which is what we breathe every day. And so there's ways you can tweak anything if you want to tell a story, which is why that's the danger of it all. And then if you have the masses who aren't educated on it, which most people aren't expecting you to go get a degree in whatever we're doing, you won't know how to interpret that. And you won't know what's right and what's wrong. And if you believe the person you believe, you're going to follow suit with that. So it's very dangerous to do that. And I don't like when people do that, because especially if you have a large audience. Like, I don't have 1 million followers, but there's some people on the internet who do. And they can say almost anything, and a good portion of that 1 million followers is going to believe what they say. And so it's a very dangerous area. And so a death is a death, whether it's from hot, cold, medium heat, it's still a death, you know. And so as climate change wages on, we're going to have more deaths in all categories in general. And that's what the huge thing is. It's not, oh, more heat versus cold deaths. No, it's deaths in general are growing. And we can't fight back to the rate that we need to. That's what the issue is. So.
And one phrase I've learned to use is premature deaths. Deaths prior to, because
death
I've
that would
had
normally have
comment on some of
occurred.
my climate
Yes.
stories too. Everyone
Yes.
dies.
Yeah.
Everyone has to
Yep.
die of something.
You died because you didn't have to is what we're really talking about. If you were meant to die, fine, you know. But if you weren't meant to die, that's what we're talking about. Yes, good point.
Delger.
This is a question, I think, mostly for Jeff. For those of us who cover climate change and specifically climate science, like, I cover the attribution studies, things like NOAA giving their monthly climate update of like, it's this much hotter this month, compared to how it was last year. I find that my stories sometimes start to get a little like formulaic and like just month after month, it's hotter again. I was wondering if you have any advice for kind of like breaking out of that and kind of making your stories fresh when it's about, similar things, similar kinds of scientific studies, like day after day.
I want to know this answer too.
That's a great question and a hard question, because we do get numb to all these. I get numb to all these data and all these new studies that come out that show some, incremental differences from the previous study, and there is a kind of numbing effect on all this stuff. And one of the reasons, in my book, I lean a lot on human narratives, whether it's about Friederike Otto doing the attribution studies, or the family that died, or the scientists I went to Antarctica with, is to try to give it some kind of human story, some human narrative, because I do think way too much writing about. One of the reasons that people have a hard time understanding what's really at stake with the climate crisis and everything is because there's so much data. And data, the temperature thing is a perfect example. You talk about 1.5 C of warming or 2 C of warming. First of all, most Americans have no idea what a C is. Are you talking about like cupcakes, or what are you talking about with C, And then like the difference between 1.5 and 2, it's like, oh, the difference between 77 and 78.5. Wow, that's scary, they don't get that, right? And so I think the skill of being a climate journalist is figuring out ways to bring that kind of data to life, and as a journalist to show judgment about which of these studies or datas and new reports and this and that are important and which are not. Because I think that a lot of journalists just say, oh, look, there's a new study from NOAA that says, sea surface temperatures are 0.7 degrees hotter than they've ever been, in February in human history. Well, is that really important? Is that really, a great story? I think part of the job of being educated about climate journalism is being able to discern an important study. And I think that that's really what separates sort of, C-level climate journalists to A-level climate journalists. And A-level climate journalists can take sometimes an obscure study or an obscure number and say, hey, this is really meaningful. And here's why. I'm going to tell you all about this. And the rest of the journalists who are covering the beat don't get that because they don't understand the full context of this information. And I think you've put your finger right on what makes a great climate journalist is being able to be educated enough about this world to make judgments. And then being skilled enough to bring, to write about them in a way that makes people understand why it's important. It's like the old, so what? Tell me why. Why should I care? I've got a lot of other things to worry about. Why do I need to care about this? And it's your job and my job to be able to explain to people, no, you need to care about this because of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going
We
to
have
say.
like 1 minute, yeah.
Okay, I'll be quick. So if I said to everybody, CO2 is reaching 400 parts per million, would anybody care? Yeah, but that's the old crap point, right? But it means nothing. And so I like what his point was, and I want to reiterate that, is that learning how to make us scientists or super nerds, whoever we are, be able to communicate to you folks in a way that you can understand what we're actually trying to say and the magnitude of these things, and then you process it and help us disseminate it, that message, working together. You know, that's essentially what the answer is, because I don't know how to tell people that these numbers matter. Like that 0.5 degree change is huge. Like we talk about it all the time in the science world. Like the whole planet warming up that much is crazy, but communicating to someone, I wouldn't know how to tell it fully. And so having a journalist mixed with a scientist, or having a journalist with a little science background, or a scientist with a little journalist background, that's the wave of the future, right? This interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary studies type ideology is the wave. And so as much as you can educate yourselves, or just pick us, reach out to us. A lot of us we'll answer your emails, we'll answer your calls. Reach out to a scientist, talk to a scientist, and hold us accountable. Say, hey, what you're saying doesn't make sense to anybody. Explain what you mean by this. Why does this matter? Why are you keep publishing these papers on this temperature change? Explain that in layman's terms, or whatever terms you need to understand it. So hold us accountable for how we explain it. And so thank you for that comment and that question.
Yeah, and my quick add-on is just study the stories and the communicators that you find compelling, Delger. Break it down. I broke down Jeff's book. I looked at what the topics were of each one of his chapters in 1 or 2 words. Those are the entrance points that worked and that held my attention throughout his book. Listen to the words and the analogies that Joseph uses. They're very effective. They're very straightforward. They're very accessible. Study those and jump off from them. And by the way, I'll end on this. If you are a C-level journalist, and believe me, I've been one a long time, the A-levels are stealing from you. You're doing good work. Thank you. This has been a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin.
Well, that was amazing. Just if I could hold your attention for just one more minute. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Joseph Wilkins and to Jeff Goodell and to Robin Lloyd for a fantastic A-level all the way panel. Before we eat more and drink more and say goodbye, I wanted to acknowledge an MVP who's in the audience. He's hiding way back there. His name is Robert Lee Holtz. There he is. And Lee has made truly spectacular contributions to our program for 15 plus years. And we didn't really get a chance to give him a proper send-off because of the pandemic. Lee was the very first evening event that SHRP did featured Lee as the speaker. He was talking about sex in Einstein's brain in October of 2005. The very last evening event that Lee hosted was sadly over Zoom, but with the aforementioned Katharine Hayhoe and a guy named Ron Klain, who went on to become the second most powerful man in the country as Joe Biden's chief of staff. And in between, Lee organized, moderated 100 plus events. I think the number is 109, Lee, but it's kind of hard to keep track. There are so many. And Lee always brought his A game to every event. He was always super prepared. He's a real wordsmith on the pages of the Wall Street Journal, but also here in live physical space in Cooper Square. And he always had the interests of our students and alums and our audiences in top of mind. And so I just wanted to personally say, and in public, acknowledge Lee's immense contributions to our program. And I've got bet you were wondering what this was doing here. 2 shirt mugs. Why 2 shirt mugs? Because Lee's wife, Jennifer Arlen, has let us borrow Lee 109 plus times over the last 15 years. I don't know, maybe she was glad to have him out of the house. I'm not sure, but 2 mugs and something to put in them. So Lee, come on up and let's give him a standing ovation. And with that, let's eat and drink and chat with our guests. And